Hi, folks. Tony Mauriello here to discuss layering, a vegetative plant propagation technique. There are actually two different techniques for propagating plants. One is sexual propagation, the regeneration of genetic materials to form a uniquely genetic individual through the formation of seed. I like to call it the science of propagation. And then asexual propagation, or vegetative propagation, which is the multiplying of plants from vegetative plant parts, such as shoots, roots, and leaves. And I like to call that the art. And the reason I call sexual propagation the science is because it's very important how you follow the techniques for gathering, for storing, and for planting seeds. But in asexual propagation, there are many different techniques, and we're going to just take a look at one today called layering. The purpose for vegetative propagation is to reproduce plants with the same characteristics as the parent plant to maintain that genetic trait. For plants that are difficult or impossible to propagate from seed, and to create large plants more quickly than propagated seed. Also, to utilize a normal plant process. We call that adventitious roots. These are roots that plants form from any non-root tissue that are produced during normal development in response to stress conditions such as flooding, nutrient deprivation, and wounding. Stem wounding is something that's used quite a bit in layering. And here are two examples. One is where half of a stem has been stripped of the bark and cambium layer down to the wood, and the other, the entire stem has been wounded. And we'll see how this is used as we go on. So layering is growing a plant from a portion of the stem that grows roots while still attached to the parent plant, and then is detached as an independent plant. The new plant received nutrients and water from the parent plant until the roots developed. The various types of layering are simple, serpentine, mound, and air, and we're going to take a look at each one of those. The simple and serpentine layering, well, for most plants with a trailing or vining growth, any vine that you can think of, can be propagated by this method. Simple, the propagation of plants by bending the tip or middle of a stem to the ground and covering a wounded section with soil so that the root and new shoots may develop. Now, you can do that at the extreme tip or maybe back a couple inches, as we'll see in a picture in just a moment. Serpentine is simple layering, just repeated over and over again. So if you have a really long stem, you can bend them into the ground, wound the stem, take it above the ground, back into the ground, and you get multiple plants out of the same process. So here's a picture showing simple layer, and you can see that the plant was wounded just about 2 or 3 inches below the tip and placed into the soil, and eventually the adventitious roots developed. And the other side of the serpentine layering, which I mentioned, is just doing the simple layering over and over again. Here's a photo that shows a plant that I developed from using simple layering. And it's not very well focused, but it's in the white oval. That's where all the roots developed, and they're hanging from the stem. And then after this happens, you snip the stem on the plant side so that now you have an independent plant that you could put into the soil. Mound layering is used to propagate heavy stemmed or closely branched plants, and as the note says, mainly for areas where seasonal changes take place. The plant is cut back severely prior to spring growth. New shoots that emerge are wounded, and soil is mounded around the base of the plant. Excuse me. So here's a picture of mound layering. You can see that the plant had 4 stems. Each one was wounded, and a pile of soil placed around the roots, or the stems, I'm sorry. And eventually the adventitious roots developed. Mound layering. The next is air layering. A stem is wounded and encased in moist sphagnum moss into which the roots grow. Once an adequate root system has been produced, the rooted stem is cut from the parent plant. The air layer is usually made at least 12 to 15 inches below the tip of the branch. The first step is to remove leaves and twigs for 3 to 4 inches above and below the point where the air layer is to be made. You remove 1 to 2 inch ring of bark. You're doing the cutting with a knife, scraping it clean, and the wood underneath will be exposed. This ensures complete removal of that cambium layer that I mentioned earlier, a layer of the cells between the bark and the wood. If this layer is not completely removed, new bark may be developed instead of roots. So here is someone cleaning stem all the way down to the wood, removing the bark and the cambium layer. And then sphagnum moss was placed around that wounded area. And here you can see some form of wrap was placed around the sphagnum moss to keep it moist and keep it tight and tied onto the stem. Here is another creative idea on the left where someone used a container, food container, and cut away at the top and bottom of the container slots over which they put the stem, and then put the sphagnum moss inside, which we don't see, but I'm sure it was in there, and put the lid on. So that's the technique. On the right side, you can see just using some type of transparent wrap and tied it to the sphagnum moss. There is, however, a commercially available idea called plant pod or root growing box. And you can see that these on the left were placed on 4 stems. And so the sphagnum moss was placed underneath the plant pod. And the photo on the right shows the development of the roots once that plant pod was opened and the roots exposed. It's important to keep the sphagnum moss moist. So many folks put little plastic tubes down into that ball of sphagnum moss where they can drop water periodically. So there's information about propagation in a book called Native Florida Plants. It basically tells you the best technique that has been found, whether it be sexual or asexual. But that's a very good text if you would like to look at that. And the second, of course, is this website on which you are there, where you are, and there's some excellent resources on this as well. And in conclusion, I'd like to introduce you to Cutting Horse Eco Center and invite you to come out. It's at 26268 Cutting Horse Lane in Bonita Springs, and you'll find very knowledgeable people there who are willing to help you. So come out and see us. Thank you very much.